Slava Isusu Christu, glory to Jesus. A long overdue next installment of our series on Catholic social teaching. Today we move from Pope Leo the 13th in the late 19th century to the 20th century with an encyclical written in 1931 by Pope Pius XI entitled Quadragesimo Anno. It was written on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of Pope Leo's publication of Rerum Novarum on the new social order. And in those 40 years, a lot had changed. You could say that when Pope Leo looked at the world, he looked at the world as a man who was used to most of the population engaged in agriculture, either in self-sufficient small farming and husbandry plots, or working for wealthier noble families. This plus a class of skilled tradespeople primarily in the cities, and then the noble people who were doing what noble people had always done. Pius XI is looking at a very different world. Wage labor has now become the norm for much of the world. And for the first time, he looks beyond Europe and, I guess, North and South America, and notices that this is even true in the Far East, in what he calls the ancient civilizations of the East. I think he's thinking of places like China and Japan and maybe even India. In 1931, the world, especially Europe, is still recovering from the horrible devastation of World War I. There's pretty much a global economic depression. The economic depression has given rise to both fascism and socialism, communism, as growing political options. Again, especially in Europe, the Russian Revolution in 1917 has changed everything there. And much of Europe could potentially go radically socialist or communist. The Spanish Civil War in 1936 will decide that question for Spain. There have been, or will be in the 30s, strong reactions against the Catholic Church in Spain and Mexico with the targeted killing of Catholic clergy. And of course, in the new Soviet Union, there is the gradual destruction of religion, especially of Catholicism, and especially of Byzantine Catholicism. Pius is a different sort of man. His father is an industrialist. He owns a textile factory in northern Italy. So Pius is personally acquainted with the whole world of industry, capital, investment, and wage labor. He's the first pope to broadcast on the radio. He founded the Pontifical Academy of Sciences as a place to gather Catholic scientists and to encourage Catholic exploration of the natural sciences. And he made, for the first time, a very interesting statement that the Catholic Church is not bound to one form of government. He kind of gives up what had always been the explicit or implicit preference of the Roman Catholic Church for Catholic monarchies. He's a pragmatist politically, and in dealing with creatures like Benito Mussolini in Italy and even Adolf Hitler in Germany, he's able to broker concordats, agreements which secure the freedom of the church to operate and to secure certain rights for the church in civil societies. And so after more than 50 years, he regained rights for the Catholic Church in Italy that had been lost in the revolution under Garibaldi in 1870. One of those being Catholic education in Italy. That's a lot going on. Before we talk about Pius's economic teaching, we should just point out, because there's so much noise on the subject, a few of the things he did in confronting the growing fascist threat in Germany and in Italy. In 1939, in reaction to the power of Nazism in Germany, he did something unusual. He wrote an encyclical letter, not in Latin, but in German, called Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern. And it had to be smuggled into Germany and read from the pulpits. It was not published first. It was heard for the first time by the church-going faithful on a particular Sunday, and the German government was left to react to it after the fact. And in Mit brennender Sorge, Pius says that whoever exalts race or the people or the state or a particular form of state or the depositories of power or any other fundamental value of the human community, however necessary and honorable be their function in worldly things, whoever raises these notions above their standard value and makes a god of them to an idolatrous level, distorts and perverts an order of the world planned and created by God. He is far from the true faith in God and from the concept of life which that faith upholds. This is a pretty clear rejection of the notions of racial superiority, national superiority, the superiority of the state over the individual, which are central to German fascism. Specifically against the obvious anti-Semitism of the German and later the Italian regimes, Pius XI writes this. He made it clear, first of all, in Mit brennender Sorge, but in a public address to pilgrims to the Vatican from Belgium in 1938, just after Benito Mussolini published the Italian Manifesto of Race, which kind of formalizes anti-Semitism in the Italian fascist regime, Pius wrote this: "Mark well that in the Catholic Mass, Abraham is called our patriarch and forefather. Anti-Semitism is incompatible with the lofty thought which that fact expresses. It, anti-Semitism, is a movement with which we Christians can have nothing to do. No, I say to you, it is impossible for a Christian to take part in anti-Semitism. It is inadmissible. Through Christ and in Christ, we are the spiritual progeny of Abraham. Spiritually, we, and by we he means Christians, spiritually we are all Semites." End quote. We'll get to Pope Pius XII and all of the calumny that surrounds his dealings with the fascist governments of Germany and Italy during the Second World War, because Pius XI reigned from 1922 to 1939. He missed the worst of World War II, and his Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, later Pius XII, inherited that mess. Getting back to the point of the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, on the 40th anniversary of Leo XIII's encyclical on the new economic order, Pope Pius notes that in the intervening 40 years, the situation has improved in many ways. He says in number 59, certainly the condition of the workers has been improved and made more equitable, especially in the more civilized and wealthy countries where workers can no longer be considered universally overwhelmed with misery and lacking the necessities of life. But since manufacturing and industry have so rapidly pervaded and occupied countless regions, not only in the countries called new, but also in the realms of the Far East that have been civilized from antiquity, the number of non-owning working poor has increased enormously, and their groans cry to God from the earth. Added to them is the huge army of rural wage workers, pushed to the lowest level of existence and deprived of all hope of ever acquiring some property in land, and therefore permanently bound to the status of non-owning worker, unless some suitable or effective remedies are applied. When you think of non-owning rural workers, think of the whole Dust Bowl problem in the United States in the 1930s, when people from places like Oklahoma were displaced to places like California. The sort of situation dramatized in a book you probably read in high school, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. One of the reasons Pius XI writes Quadragesimo Anno is in response to the opinion of some in the Catholic Church that Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum was too conservative, came down too much on the side of the owner, the industrialist, the capitalist. And so Pius recalls some of the things that Leo actually achieved in Rerum Novarum. First of all, the clear condemnation of socialism. Secondly, demonstrating the real roots of the social and economic unrest of the first half of the 20th century, not so much in economic theory, but rather in moral problems like greed and envy. And therefore calling for the only viable solution to the problem, no political program, but namely the reform of morals. Pope Pius praises the lay movements that have emerged in response to Rerum Novarum in the previous 40 years, and notes that in the realm of theology, or in the realm of Catholic thought perhaps, a whole, what he calls a true Catholic social science has been created. And I would venture to say that this true Catholic social science, an approach to economic, political, social questions rooted in Catholic teaching and proposed to the arena of public debate, is something that is sadly missing in the United States. Catholic professionals, Catholic academics often seem afraid to bring the perspective of their faith to debate. Politicians, I need not name names, are all too willing to just disavow themselves of clear church teaching on particular subjects in order to get elected. And what has not happened in the United States has been the creation of academies for such Catholic professionals in sociology, psychology, economics, and so on, to gather and work together to craft a Catholic contribution to public debate. Just hasn't happened. Catholic professionals all too often act just like Catholic politicians and check their faith at the door and simply use the indifferent or perhaps hostile tools of social and economic sciences the way any non-believer would, even if in their private lives they maintain a fervent Catholic faith. We're capable of this schizophrenia, and it's quite obvious in our society. Pius also notes that as a result of Rerum Novarum, Leo's teaching has had an effect even outside Catholic circles, and notes the number of labor laws that have been enacted in various industrialized countries. He also notes the progress that has been made in the organization of Catholic charitable and benevolent societies organized by workers and for workers. And here we might mention again our own Catholic benevolent society, the Greek Catholic Union, founded in 1891, the same year Leo wrote his encyclical. Pius also credits Pope Leo with a clear condemnation of what in European documents of this period is called liberalism. And here we need to be careful, because liberal here does not mean what the average American thinks liberal means in American politics today. Liberalism, in the sense that both Leo and Pius used the word, the way it was used classically in European politics in the early 20th century, liberalism means a belief in limiting government, limiting oversight of economic activity. What you might call a laissez-faire approach to economics and social questions. In this sort of liberalism, the state becomes the mere guardian of general good order, but leaves lots of room for questions to work themselves out on the ground, if you will. But the inspiring idea behind this liberalism is really social Darwinism, is an application of the evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin to human interaction, so that we leave the marketplace open and let the fittest survive. Which means that those who are less fit, limited in their physical or intellectual abilities, are left to die. And that is incompatible with the literal meaning of the gospel. That sort of social Darwinism still pervades a lot of American political thought. Not on the left, where you'd expect liberals to be, but on the right. Liberalism asserted individual rights, and especially private property, as the foundation of freedom against the state. Here again, this is an idea one hears much more of on the right in Republican circles nowadays than in what we expect to be the more liberal Democratic parties. It's as if the name has ceased to mean what it used to mean. We would consider the assertion of individual rights, private property, and freedom against the incursions of the state as conservative values. Leo and Pius both say there has to be more to the state than simply building a safe arena and letting humanity duke it out on the economic and social levels. Pius notes that while Pope Leo had envisioned the creation of Catholic labor unions, in many places that didn't happen. In fact, it really has not survived just about anywhere. And as a result, Catholics, he notes, are forced to join secular unions. And here Pius warns that where Catholics get involved in secular labor unions, they need to be cautious that the unions are not founded on materialistic, atheistic, socialist principles, and that these unions leave free the conscience of the individual member to practice his or her faith. Pius in 1931 is still calling for Catholic unions where possible, and where not possible, for Catholic workers' organizations that will encourage Catholic workers to grow in their understanding of Catholic teaching and in their practice of Catholic morality. In Europe, in places like Italy and Spain and Belgium and Germany, a particular organization called Catholic Action grew up in the early 20th century and was very, very influential in attempting to bring the teachings of Leo and later of Pius into the arena of public discussion and into practice in the marketplace. These were places where Catholic workers could be supported to grow in the understanding of their faith, to be supported in the practice of their faith. They were a place for material as well as moral support, and they did a lot of good. They did so much good that in Germany, Hitler ordered the leader of Catholic Action in Bavaria, Erich Klausener, to be murdered. He was that much of a threat. In the United States, in 1933, an organization called The Catholic Worker was formed. It's not too well known among mainstream Catholics because here in the States, Catholic Worker took a decidedly left of center turn and was, for example, vocally opposed to the Vietnam War, very much on the forefront of the civil rights movement for African Americans. And Catholic Worker was there way before the average Catholic was willing to consider some of those questions. In a church of immigrants and the children of immigrants, there was often very much more pressure to seem like loyal Americans than to freely apply the principles of our faith to American political questions. Maybe that's still true. Maybe we're still, as Monsignor Charles Pope wrote recently in Our Sunday Visitor, American Catholics seem way more devoted to their politics than they do to their religion. His judgment, not mine. After World War II, these Catholic action movements in Europe, where most countries have parliamentary systems with many, many parties, Catholic action kind of morphed into what were called Christian democratic parties. And those have tended to wane in influence and even to drift from their Catholic values over the course of the years in some cases. Pius notes that what hasn't happened, what Leo hoped for, was not just labor unions of workers, but also associations of managers and employers, groups of Catholic industrialists who could together work out solutions and create a fair market in which workers could be empowered to earn a living wage in healthy working conditions. These associations of managers, employers, and industrialists and capitalists really never took off. Perhaps the most important principle that Pope Pius states in Quadragesimo Anno, and he's simply restating more clearly something that Leo had said in Rerum Novarum, is the answer to what you often hear Americans, and not just non-Catholic Americans, say, namely, the church should stay out of politics. Pius XI wrote, speaking of himself as the Pope, as the primary teaching authority in the Catholic Church, there resides in us the right and the duty to pronounce with supreme authority, to pronounce with supreme authority upon social and economic matters. The church has to speak on social and moral issues. Why? Because they involve the choices made by human beings. They invariably involve questions of right or wrong, or of more or less good. They invariably impact on basic questions like justice, human dignity, free will, and as a result, they are not indifferent questions for our salvation. In Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo had said, the church holds that it is unlawful for her to mix without cause in these temporal concerns. And by that, Leo meant we're not equipped in the teaching authority of the church to pronounce authoritatively on the methodologies, on the techniques, on the day-to-day workings of social or economic systems. So he says, not, of course, in matters of technique, for which she is neither suitably equipped nor endowed by office, but in all things that are connected with the moral law. Whatever the techniques or methodologies or principles might be that govern economic or social issues, to the degree that they impact questions of right and wrong and justice and human dignity and our salvation, the church needs to help people see where the values that are at stake lie and where the priorities are. And so in Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius simply rejects the claim that economics does not depend on the moral law, as if this has nothing to do with morality. This is just business. That's how it is in business. Human beings do business. The business decisions made by employers, investors, industrialists, capitalists, impact the lives of countless thousands, if not millions, and have the potential to move in one direction or another so much of the resources on which all human beings commonly depend. To this degree, questions of economics and business are moral questions about which the church has to provide guidance. And Pope Pius reminds us that the moral law, just as it commands us to seek our supreme and final end in the whole scheme of our activity, also commands us to seek directly in each kind of activity those purposes which we know that nature, or rather God as the author of nature, established for that kind of action. There's two interesting things there. The first is a reminder, and you can't repeat this too often, a reminder that in anything you and I do in this world, Our goal is not just to succeed at this thing. Our goal is to attain salvation. Our goal is to inherit the kingdom of heaven. We can't just bracket that off as something we do on Sundays. It can't be stated too often that our ultimate goal, the inheritance of the kingdom of heaven, has to color the choices we make in every individual decision, however mundane and material they may seem to be. Secondly, that there is a natural law that God has built into human beings and has built into the world he created for human beings. A certain order that is there for our good to guide us toward the attainment of our eternal salvation, and an order that we can only transgress to the damage of ourselves and the societies we form. This natural order includes things like the dignity of the individual person and the person's informed free will, the rational nature of human beings and their obligation to inform themselves, the primary role of the family as the basic building block of any larger society, and the community in which God's plan for our salvation is primarily lived out. The fundamental right to private property as necessary for human beings to express themselves in labor, provide for their families, and to provide for their future. Private property as a tool for our providence is intimately connected with one of the ways you and I live out the image and likeness of God in ourselves. We get to plan, we get to provide, we get to be provident as God is provident. When was the last time you heard somebody in an economic discussion talk about the image and likeness of God or the kingdom of heaven? Yet if you and I don't keep those ideas in the forefront of our mind, we risk accepting a cheaper vision of ourselves, a vision of ourselves that is easily abused. And we risk accepting a cheap offer of happiness, a happiness that cannot last, that cannot survive death, and cannot even survive economic or political or social upheaval. That's probably enough for one session. We'll probably end up doing 3 or 4 sessions on Quadragesimo Anno. But as you can see, early in the 20th century, the Catholic Church was looking with a very, very clear and practical eye at a very, very ugly moment in human history, in between 2 of the bloodiest conflicts the world has ever known, and pointing a very clear path through the thickets of politics and economics by reminding us who we are and why God made us. Those are the 2 things worth remembering in any decision we make. Glory to Jesus Christ.